Although wine is made from grapes and people think of this as a fruit product, but there are some processes in the production of wine that includes animal products like egg whites or bone, marrow, fish oil. Are there any alternate products that can be used in the production of wine as fining agents so that you're not having any type of animal products and you are having truly vegan wine?
It's not quite a well advertised thing at this point, but it's gaining popularity for sure because people are looking for vegan products. Olden days, if you want to get a little graphic, they used to use the blood of an ox. They would take that blood and put it in, same idea as the egg white, same idea as the diatomaceous syrup. They would extract everything and they could separate that out from the wine.
Welcome to Cool Life Podcast, brought to you by therealthingdating.com. www.therealthingdating.com.
Polydor Records for out scouting. This girl grabbed my bangs and ran my head right into the speaker.
Oh,
And everyone heard like this, yeah.
When we shot the scene in Good Will Hunting, I didn't know who most of these people were at the time. I mean, they weren't stars. It was Gus Van Sant that directed it. Gus Van Sant was on the floor with Matt Damon's character. I didn't even know who Matt Damon was at that time.
I'm Eva John. I'm a former candidate for local government. I was a children's television entertainer, and I love this world, and I believe we should take care of each other and have a lot of fun along the way. Welcome to Cool Life. Here we go. And welcome to Cool Life Podcast. I'm Eva John, and today we are continuing part 2 of our conversation with Chris COLANERI of COLANERI Estate Winery. Chris, welcome back.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me back.
I'm glad to have you here for our ongoing part 2 conversation about your winery and winemaking. Now, we did talk about your estate quite a bit in our part 1 conversation. Absolutely the most beautiful location and a beautiful piazza where the public can enjoy a flight of wine, charcuterie board, various wine experiences with you. And can you tell us once again your website?
Absolutely. So it's culinarywines.com, COLANERI wines.com.
And so we'll put that up on video as well for our viewers to see. Now, Chris, in the process of winemaking, yeast is used. It's a normal part of it. But is there such a thing as a yeast-free wine?
So yes and no, depending on the definition of yeast-free. So you need yeast. Yeast is what converts your sugars to alcohol. But there are cultured yeasts or added yeasts, and there are natural yeasts. Natural yeasts are basically naturally occurring. They're within the grapes, they're on the vines, they're everywhere around us, and they are going to be present. So you can't remove the yeast in that respect. It's not like you're removing yeast, but a lot of times it's referred to as no yeast added. It means that you're not adding cultured yeast to make the wine or to do the fermentation. So they're a lot of times referred to as natural wines or wild fermentations, basically using whatever's naturally occurring there to do the fermentation. We've done a couple wines that way, but it's a little scary with us. Our wines are a little bit bolder. We use a process called appassimento, which means we're drying the grapes prior to making the wine. So our juices and sugars are higher, bolder, more intensified. So we're dealing in higher alcohol contents. When you do that, it's a very much more straining environment on the yeast. And with wild yeast, you don't really know what you're getting. Every year is a different adventure. You don't know how strong or how weak they are. So to play in that realm is a little bit risky. You could have yeast that aren't that strong, and when they get to that little bit elevated alcohol content, they start to die off, and you start to get what are called stuck fermentations, which are basically wines that are no longer fermenting. They have sugar left over, and the alcohol hasn't all converted from sugar to alcohol yet. And so it can be very difficult to restart that fermentation. And that's why you don't really want to get into that territory, especially in those high alcohol levels. The way I usually explain it to people is, imagine you just had a dozen donuts and someone puts one more donut in front of you. You're going to almost vomit because you don't want that extra donut, right? But if you've had one donut and someone offers you a second, you're like, okay, I think I'll eat that donut. The yeasts are kind of the same way. Once they get into that higher alcohol level, they've had that dozen donuts. They're like, oh, I'm a little bit strained now to finish off that last bit of fermentation. So with the natural yeast, sometimes they're just like, okay, I'm out. Whereas with the cultured yeast, a lot of the cultured yeast, you can select them based on wanting them to be more tuned to the higher alcohol contents. So that's where we kind of get into that realm where we say, okay, we're going to select this particular yeast to do this kind of fermentation because we know we're going into that territory. If it's a lower alcohol, then yeah, maybe you have a better opportunity to do that, but it's risky. It is very risky, but there are lots of people doing wild fermentations and natural wines for sure. There is that ability. You have the two sides.
So do you pick from one season or another to decide whether or not to make this type of not quite yeast free, but wild fermentation type wine?
Yeah, you can. Absolutely. You can do 1 year where you do, another year you don't. It just depends on wine you're trying to make, what you think that year is going to be like, and how the yeasts you think are going to perform. So a lot of times what winemakers will do is they'll do like a little starter, essentially taking a little bit of the juice, starting the fermentation, adding a little bit more juice, seeing how they ferment, and basically adding and to see how much that yeast can actually handle. If they are confident that the yeast are strong enough, they'll then take it and put it into the whole batch. So you can kind of do a little test that way, but again, it's just risky because you're not dealing with a couple $1,000s here. You're dealing with tens of thousands of dollars that if you screw up, it's a bit of an expensive mistake. So a lot of times it becomes a safety thing, or maybe you say, hey, you know what, we're just going to do a little small batch this way, try it out, make sure it goes okay. But it depends on, the year you're given, if you're doing this kind of wine or that kind of wine. So you can make that choice and you can change, you can pivot year to year based on what you're getting.
Now, of course, I've just learned about cheeses being flavored with wines. And so I guess you can take those not so successful yeast experimentation batches and you can sell them to the cheesemakers.
Maybe, hey, you can do that.
I can hook you up.
That's it, perfect. Some people have even given them to distilleries, because then they'll take that and they'll distill it and use the alcohol content. So there's things you can do. It's just not an ideal situation. That's
Right.
that's the end of the day what you're dealing with, right?
Of course, because as you've mentioned, in large batches, that's a lot of product that has already cost something to make that may not result in something that can be sold in the way you intended anyway.
For sure.
Interesting. Yeast. Now, you know that although wine is made from grapes, and so people think of this as, a fruit product, but there are some processes in the production of wine that includes animal products like egg whites or bone, marrow, fish oil. Now, are there any alternate products that can be used in the production of wine as fining agents so that you're not having any type of animal products and you are having truly vegan wine?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not quite a well advertised thing at this point, but it's gaining popularity for sure because people are looking for vegan products. And I think because it was such a minor part of the winemaking that isn't so, like when we talk about barrels, everyone knows wine goes into barrels.
Right.
Where with the fining, people aren't necessarily knowing about that process in the winemaking process. So it's becoming a little bit more of a well-known thing. Where with us, we're not using any of the egg whites or anything along those lines for fining. We use very frequently diatomaceous earth. which is essentially ground up clay and earth materials, which apparently is actually good to ingest in certain ways too, because essentially it attracts all the insoluble proteins and makes them larger so that we can filter them out. So that helps us. Olden days, if you want to get a little graphic, they used to use the blood of an ox. They would take that blood and put it in, same idea as the egg whites, same idea as the diatomaceous earth. They would extract everything and they could separate that out from the wine. So these days, I know a lot of people still use things like egg whites, gelatin, a few different others that you mentioned as well, where we're sticking to pretty much just the diatomaceous earth and mostly on the whites. We don't do anything on the reds when it comes to that side of things.
I see. So technically, then you really are making a vegan wine, aren't you?
Essentially, yeah, without using that side of things. The other way that, and again, this is not what we do, but I had a lady come in who was allergic to shellfish, and she had a concern that if consuming one of the wines might trigger her allergy. And at first I was a little bit confused, but then looking into it more, some filter pads and some ways of filtering wine actually contain ground up crustacean shells. So if by filtering it through that could pick up the allergies. So I thought that was interesting too. So that's another way you might say, okay, you know what, we can put these labels on it. But for us at this point, yes, even if we don't have the label on it, we're making those wines pretty well vegan.
That's pretty amazing. Well, I hope at some point someone will go through the magic marker and just add that this is a vegan product, because there's certainly a market for it.
For sure. Yeah, there's so many things to put on the back of a label. It's wild because now you have sustainable labels and vegan labels. There's so many things to add, and now there's talk of potentially putting that nutritional value label on the back, which
No,
I know
don't.
it'll ruin the whole vibe of the wine label, right?
I do not just that, but I do not want to know what kind of nutritional value, because then sooner or later someone's going to put a calorie count, and I do not.
You don't want to know.
I don't want
I'm just
to know.
enjoying my glass of wine. Okay, leave me alone.
Yeah, the sunset, the glass of wine.
That's it.
Lovely cheeses and biscuits. Thank you. Well, no, we'll leave that for someone. It's your decision. Okay, you do have my permission.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I was waiting for that one.
Once again, if it comes down to that. Now, in the production of wine, there are times when we hear that wines can be made with other types of fruits, such as peaches, strawberries, and plums. And now, do you consider these to be wines in the end, since it's not using grapes of any kind?
Yeah, it's still at the end of the day wine, right? It's still converting sugar to alcohol through a fruit product. So it's still considered a wine. It's still classified as a wine. It's just not traditional in the sense of wine, people thinking of it being as grapes. But they're still wines. It's just not quite as popular. There was one or two maybe in this area that was doing some fruit wines. And one was doing really well with one of their products that way. And then there was one that was quite a few of their products they were doing that way. It's just not as big of a market, I would say, with respect to, traditional wine. But at the end of the day, it's still wine. You're still doing the same things. You're still taking that fruit juice and creating alcohol and creating an alcoholic product out of it, right? It's still by definition wine. So definitely, yeah, absolutely. I have no issues.
Has Culinary Estate Winery been making in the past, present, future, any types of these non-grape wines?
We haven't, no, with respect to the winery. I'm sure my grandfather or one of his Italian buddies at some point figured that they were going to ferment one of the fruits that they grew on their property.
Okay.
But in terms of the winery itself, we stick strictly to the grape side of things.
Well, it's nice to know that you're purists, and I guess technically anything can be fermented. And I've heard of also in different regions in Italy where they would make like elderflower wine, and that's certainly just with a quick brief fermentation. I haven't experienced it myself, but it's good to know that you are purists working with grapes, and then you're specializing with that.
Absolutely.
For now, we're going to take a break to talk about our sponsors and supporters, and then we'll be back for more wine and winery talk with Chris Culinary on Cool Life Podcast. Those lonely days of lockdowns and isolation are gone for good. Go to www.therealthingdating.com. That's www.therealthingdating.com. It's time to share. Share your time, share your life, share your love. www.therealthingdating.com. Join for free. Upgrade at any time, starting at just $5.99 a month. www.therealthingdating.com. Because it's time. You're listening to the Cool Life Podcast. We'll be back in 3, 2, 1. And we are back on Cool Life Podcast with our conversation continuing with Chris Culinary of Culinary Estate Winery in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And Chris, the wine growing industry is very important here in Ontario. The wine growing industry contributes $5.5 billion to the Ontario economy every year. That's billion with a B. Like Bezos. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of wine transactions. And that's a healthy wine economy. And in this atmosphere of growth in the wine industry, do you see Culinary Estate Winery increasing their production and their operations in Ontario?
Yeah, it is a huge industry for sure, and it's just gonna get bigger and better with respect to contributions. There was just recently in the news quite a bit of traction with respect to a report that how much more it could give with assistance from taxations and government aspects of things. So it's just going to get bigger and contribute more to the economy. In terms of our aspect of things, yes, we would like to get a little bit bigger. We don't want to get huge. That's not why we opened the place and called it our last name. We want to make sure that we're proud of the product, and doing so means on a little bit of a smaller scale. So ideally, we'd like to be in that kind of 15 to 20,000 case production, where we're at that 10,000 now. But we also have more of the building to grow into. So the entire left-hand side of the building still is unfinished. So we still have to finish off that side of things and complete growing into our own building. So yes, absolutely, expanding is certainly one of the things we want to do, but we're expanding within rather than expanding out, which was the idea in the first place. You know, build a shell of a bigger building that little by little you can finish off, rather than start small and expand. So absolutely, it's going to be something that we want to do in the next little while, and again, just keeping in mind that production level, we don't want to get out of control as well, because the bigger you get, it's hard to maintain control of the quality, no matter what industry it happens to be in, whether it's wine or cookies. The bigger you get, you can't maintain that artisanal quality aspect of things, which is what we want to maintain.
Of course, I can understand that. Now, for the industry of winemaking, again, here in Ontario, there are currently 185 wineries in Ontario, and that's a good, strong, growing number. But Culinary Estate Winery really stands out amongst these wineries because of the unique, picturesque configuration of your main building, having that look of the piazza. Can you tell me, what was the inspiration to have that village square piazza look?
Well, thank you for the wonderful compliment. Holy moly. Thank you. The idea originally was the shape of the building first. And we said, you know what, it would be nice to have it in the shape of a C. First of all, for our family name. And secondly, we wanted it to be an embrace and more of a welcoming atmosphere, rather than sometimes you can get a little bit of an intimidation factor with wineries, and we didn't want that. We wanted it to be welcoming. So the shape, right away, we wanted it to be the case. So what people are looking at on the picture there is the inside of the C. So if you had an overhead view, it would be a semicircle. But once we had that shape, then we said, okay, well, we have the shape, but wouldn't it be cool if it was like walking down a street in Italy, where every section was a different piece and a different family owned each different section. So it's all different colors, different stone, changing different materials along the way. We wanted to make it look as old as we possibly could. So that was kind of the concept. We just took all pictures from all different parts of Italy, including my dad's hometown, and just kind of shoved everything together. And that's kind of what we came up with, including the bell tower on the one side, and just, again, walking down the street in Italy, feeling like you're just relaxed. And that was the immediate premise of saying, hey, that's what we want people to feel when they come up. We want them to feel welcome. We want them to feel like they're coming home and feeling like they're not in the hustle bustle of everyday life. So that was kind of how that whole thing transpired. I'm simplifying it. This was months and months of looking at drawings back and forth of what we can come up with, especially nowadays with when you send it to an architect, they say, okay, we're doing this contemporary looking thing. And we said, no, we want to do the opposite. We want to go back in time versus forward in time. So it was a lot of back and forth and a lot of months of talk and a few glasses of wine, of course. But essentially it was back and forth of saying, okay, this is what we want. This is the look we want. We want our Italian heritage to come out. And that's what came out of it.
It's beautifully configured. It's really, now knowing that you wanted this to be an embrace, you pushed all the right psychological buttons, because there is that comforting, secure feeling, and you don't want to leave when you're sitting there.
I know.
And really seeing the different configurations of the buildings. I love it.
Thank you.
Now, I do want to ask you about some of the interactions of science and nature with what's occurring right now, because, technically the understanding of wine growing is that colder temperatures will mean a higher acidity in grapes, and that would mean a higher acidity in the wine that's made from those grapes. And right now in Ontario, we're enjoying some unusually warm winter weather, and there are a few times I wanted to put my geraniums back out, and it's quite a little turn of Mother Nature. Now, as a result of this kind of a winter, does that mean we can expect a more sweet wine in the next growing season?
Not necessarily. There's a lot that goes into it. You're right with respect to the general climate, the general area that we're in, where, in those cooler climate areas, you get those higher acidic feels, higher acidity in the wines, more rain, therefore more acidity in the soil, therefore more acidity in your grapes, right? Whereas California, I kind of touched on it a little earlier, where they have lower acidity. They have such low acidity that a lot of times they're constantly adding acid to help their wines. So yes and no, there's a lot that goes into it. With respect to the winter that we're having now, it is a little scary, because in Niagara, as soon as it could be warm, it could also be very, very cold in the snap of a finger. So it is a little concerning. There's a fine balance. We want cold, but we don't want it too cold. And what ends up happening if you go too cold is exactly what British Columbia is dealing with right now. We got reports, very, very unfortunate, because as a farmer, you never want to hear this. They had such cold weather that they're at a 97 to 99% loss of their yield for this year.
Wow.
Yes. So when you get into that -20 and below, you start to deal with bud damage. You start to deal with the vine itself dying, but more so the buds dying. So when your bud dies, you have nothing that grows out of that for the year. Your plant still might be alive. It might push, we call them suckers, from the bottom, but your buds themselves will have nothing there. And if you have nothing coming out of your buds, you have no grapes coming out of your buds, and therefore you have no yield. And this is exactly what they're dealing with. So with us, we're kind of dealing with the opposite right now, but like I said, it could change on a dime, and we've had that happen before. So when it's this warm, it is a little scary, because the way I always kind of explain it to people is, imagine you were in a room and it was room temperature, and all of a sudden someone snapped their finger and it was -10. You would be frozen. Whereas if it was -9 in that room for another few hours and then they turned it to -10, no one would feel that difference. It's like a summer day in Canada. Right? The vines are kind of the same, where they have to climatize themselves a little bit. And so if it gets too warm, they're not used to that cold and it gets a little scary, or they start to think, if this was March, they're like, oh, we're getting ready to warm up. We're getting ready to wake up. And then it drops back down again. And that could be very detrimental as well.
So I guess these are what they call winter kills, that if it comes to spring and the parts of the branches that should be making buds and growing again are actually gone for good.
Big time. Yeah. So you could either lose them in the fall with a frost. You can lose them in the fall with an early cold snap. You can lose them in the heart of winter if it gets that cold, which is again what BC is dealing with. And you can lose them in the spring with a cold snap or a frost again. So there's a lot of times along the way where you can lose these vines. And this is where, when you talk about acidity in cool climate areas, California doesn't have these issues. So, and I always tell a story that I was watching the news in California in February, and I was looking through trying to find hockey, but that was not a possibility in California. And I came across a news story where the farmers were worried, the grape farmers were worried, and it said on the bottom, farmers worried as temperatures near freezing. And I started laughing because they said, we're dealing with negative temperatures most of the winter. These guys are worried that it's getting close to zero, right?
Yeah.
But that does come.
Wait, they're talking Fahrenheit, so they mean 32.
32. I'm sorry. Yes, they're talking. It would be 32 there. Yes, but they were worried that it was getting to that point where we're dealing with that all the time. So you always have to worry about that. We don't want it to get too cold, but we do like some cold, and we do like some precipitation to allow moisture within the ground. But with that does come with higher levels of acidity, as you were saying. So you do get your higher levels of acidity in the soil, which translates to your grapes, which therefore translates to your wines, which means we have to integrate that acidity a little bit better with the wine. But the acidity is what carries your finish, which is what we were talking about a little earlier about your finish. It carries your finishes as well. So a lot of times California wines can be big up front and then they die off quick, where if dealt with properly, the acidity naturally in our grapes can carry that finish longer.
Interesting. So that's a special hallmark of our region at this time in this climate.
Very much so.
Now, I wonder, is there a way to blanket your vines if there's severe cold coming, to like just put a little winter coat over them or something?
So you know what we do on some of them now. So certain grape varietals will respond to cold better than others, just like people. Some people can deal with cold better than others. And a vine like Syrah, which Shiraz and Syrah, they're the same thing, but Syrah doesn't deal with cold that well. It's one of the first that will feel the effects of the cold. So we lost the Syrah for 2 years, 13 into 14 and 14 into 15. We had 2 brutal winters. They were the polar vortex winters. There was those 2. And we, after those 2 years, started covering them with thermal blankets. So every year we put thermal blankets on them. And I laughed when you made your comment, because that's exactly what my mother says. She says, oh, we're tucking them in for the winter, right? But exactly, we do that every year. We cover them up so that just in case we do get that cold snap, we do have that extra layer of insurance. Unfortunately, that obviously comes with cost because it's labor. But it's a much cheaper cost than if we were to lose or have to replant those vines.
So right on the spot, I came up with a good idea. I'm clearly a wine
You're onto
genius.
something here.
Wine genius right here.
That's it. Absolutely.
Now, with some of the adjustments in the winter that we're having, the climate we're having, for anyone who has had a garden or noticed, the springtime when buds come out, and knowing the ebb and flow of nature and temperature. Now, does a good cold winter help to give a good crop in the growing season, the way tulips, for example, as the bulb needs a good cold winter before it can actually bloom? Is that a necessity to get a good crop, to have a good cold winter?
So again, you're in that fine line territory, right? Where we say, what is a good cold winter? Because cold, like cold is not a good thing, right? But having said that, cold means we can get some snow, we can get some precipitation, we can kill off a lot of the insects and mites that might be detrimental. So cold is good. We do want cold because we want those vines to shut down for the winter, but too cold is bad. So it's not like we need it. It's not like the vines will still wake up, they'll still produce. It's not like they would produce better if it's colder or warmer. It's just there's danger. If it's warmer, you're like, okay, is it going to go up or down? Are the vines going to wake up too early? Are they properly in their dormancy state? If it's too cold, you're on your hands and knees praying that it's just going to get warmer and that they're going to survive that winter. So there's that fine line that we say, okay, if it's in that -10, -15, we're happy. But once it gets to that -20, we're like, eh. And if it's too warm, again, this time of the year into March, we're like, please don't get warm too soon. So nothing is ever perfect. If you're ever talking to a farmer and they aren't complaining, you're not talking to a farmer, because we're always complaining about something. It's not too cold. It's not cold enough. It's not cold when you want it to be. It's not raining when you want it to be. Everything is a complaint when it comes to farmers.
I understand that. In fact, I have heard that from a farmer and horse rancher, that I guess it is a universal truth of working under the cloak of nature.
I think if we could control the weather, we still wouldn't be happy.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Now, with that, we're going to take a little break to talk about our sponsors and supporters, and we'll be back on Cool Life Podcast.
Those lonely days of lockdowns and isolation are gone for good. Go to www.therealthingdating.com. That's www.therealthingdating.com. It's time to share. Share your time, share your life, share your love. www.therealthingdating.com. Join for free. Upgrade at any time, starting at just $5.99 a month. www.therealthingdating.com. Because it's time. This is Cool Life Podcast. Please remember to subscribe to Cool Life on your streaming service and on YouTube as Hellenique Today. That's HELENIQUE Today. Because that helps us to bring more cool stuff to your ears. You're listening to the Cool Life Podcast. We'll be right back.
And we are back on Cool Life Podcast. I'm Eva John, and we are continuing our conversation with Chris Culinary of Culinary Estate Winery in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Chris, now, sometimes people don't pay attention to the fact that there's a lot of hard work involved in wine growing. And there's the glamorous side of it, there's the marketing side of it. In the work that you do you ever find that you still have to put on your big mucky boots and walk through the acres and acres of vines?
Absolutely. If you're not doing it, you have problems, because you have to keep an eye on absolutely everything, especially in the vineyard, because if things don't go right in the vineyard, they're certainly not going to go right in the winery. There's only so many games you can play. If you're, as I say, garbage in, garbage out. If you're bringing in garbage, you're going to put out garbage. So you have to be out in the vineyard. You have to be checking things. So we're going through, myself, my father, we're always going through the vineyard. My father's still on the sprayer. He's still on the cultivator. He still goes through the vineyard doing all of that. And again, you just always have to be checking, because things could go south on you really quick, just based on a temperature change or a pattern change or something along those lines. And you kind of catch things early. So you definitely got to go through, especially when it comes time to harvest. The harvest is basically saying, okay, my father, myself, the winemaker will go out and say, okay, yes or no, is it time to do this? Is it time to do that? We'll check on things. So we're always going through the vineyard. Processing wise, we're still on the sorting table. We're still going through checking grapes, making sure we don't want this in there, we don't want that in there. We're still in the heart of it. My father's still on the forklift dumping grapes and raking grapes onto the sorting table. Like, we're always there and throughout those most important times of the winemaking process. So if you're not doing it, then that's that might be either you're a very large winery or you're not focusing on the quality of things, because it is such an important part of the winemaking process to be there throughout that stage of it.
Well, I'm glad that is a part of your routine and your process and your hands-on work with your winery and with the actual vines. Now, Chris, if you were to talk to somebody who is interested in starting their own wine growing business, what would you give them as advice as far as how they should prepare?
Short answer, don't do it. No, but in truth, it's, as we just talked about, it's a lot of work. Very often we'll get people at the winery, oh, when I retire, I would love to open a winery and a vineyard. And I say, honestly, it's a lot more work than a retirement gig. It's a lot more that goes into it, and it's not a quick return. You have to be in it for a very long time. From a financial standpoint, the average break-even point for a winery is 10 to 15 years after opening. So it's not a quick return. You're even getting your first bottle of wine, you're at least 5, 6, 7 years out, because by the time you plant, by the time you take care of those plants for 3 years before they give you anything, by the time you buy all your tanks, by the time you get all your barrels, by the time you age that wine for another 2 years, you're already 6 years in before you've even got a product that you can sell anybody. So it's basically you got to be in it for the long haul. And if you don't have the passion, then don't bother. If you're looking to make money, not the best area to make money quick in. The running joke is, how do you make $1 million in the wine industry? Is you start with 3. And that's because it's just such a terrible return early on your investment, because there's so much output. So advice I can give somebody is make sure you have the passion to do it, because you won't put up with the day-to-day stuff if you don't have the passion. Right. And B, you got to be in it for a long haul, because it's not going to be a quick return. And you got to truly, truly, truly have a passion to see it through.
That's good advice. Take note. If that's the direction you want to head, you've heard it directly from experience.
Think long and hard, for sure.
Now, I will mention that you said that with a smile. So.
Yes. Is that a pain smile or a regular smile? I'll leave that to you.
Well, I'd say it's a smile of the purveyor who owns and operates the wine estate where I had a wonderful visit myself. So
thank you.
I would say that the end result, it's a win-win for what you're enjoying and for what your guests enjoy when they visit. Now, I do want to ask you, now this may be the hard question, what do you find to be the most challenging part of the wine growing business?
There's a lot, for sure. Right from get-go is weather. I mean, it's something completely out of your control. And I say to everybody, yeah, let's build a multi-billion-dollar business in Ontario based on something we're not sure is going to grow. It's nerve-wracking, right? You have no control other than constantly looking at your phone saying, oh, what's the weather going to turn to today? You have no ammunition to combat what you're dealt with. So that's a challenge right away, because it's not in your control. Another challenge is dealing with the day-to-day operations of operating within Ontario. There's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it government-wise. There's a lot of other aspects on the back end that are a challenge. There's also the fact that you have multiple industries that you're in at the same time. I say to everybody, listen, we're agriculture, we're manufacturing, and we're retail tourism. We're all 3 of them at the exact same time. That comes with a challenge. It's hard to say, okay, we're going to do this and have it not affect those. We can do this in the growing, but well, how does that affect what people are going to purchase in the retail store? And so that's a big challenge, that you have to think of so many different avenues rather than just, okay, X leads to Y, so there's so many challenges along the way that make it difficult. But I say to everybody, regardless of the challenges, I can get up from my desk and say, hey, you know what, I'm going to go check on that wine and taste a little bit of the wine from the tank and say, hey, you know what, I need to clear my mind and go that road. And unfortunately, you don't have that in some other jobs, but in mine, I'm lucky enough to have that, to say, okay, we're dealing with this challenge. Maybe I don't have to hit it head on right now. Let me just clear my brain, but I can go through a walk through the vineyard and clear my thoughts that way, which sometimes leads to other challenges, because then you're like, oh, I got to do this in the vineyard and that in the vineyard.
Right. You find more work while you're relaxing.
100%, 100%.
But that's a heck of a nice staff lounge if you get to go.
It's not bad. Yeah, it's not bad.
For sure. Well, by the same token, I wonder, what do you consider to be the most rewarding part of being an owner operator of Culinary Estate Winery?
Yeah, a challenge. There's big challenges, but big rewards, right? They always say high risk, high reward. And the rewards certainly start from the same area. They start from the same, walking through your vineyard and just seeing a beautiful, lush vineyard, beautiful grapes on the vine. That's reward number one. It's cool. Every year I get such a kick out of seeing the buds come and swell and break. I get a kick out of how fast they grow every year. I get such a kick out of when the grapes turn color. Like that's so rewarding because you're nurturing them, right? Then right to the wine. You taste that wine and it's a good wine, and you're just like, oh, that's so rewarding. It's such an amazing thing to see something you're so passionate about turn out so well. It's such a reward to taste that wine as a finished product and say, oh, that's what we want. That's number one, right? And then right to the front end is seeing people genuinely happy to enjoy the thing that you're doing, in terms of the atmosphere, in terms of the wine, in terms of the how they feel when they're at the winery. That's a huge reward, because people can vocalize that, and they'll tell you those things like you did to me, and that's probably one of the biggest rewards, is knowing that something we've created has benefited others. And it's such a humbling feel, because people are enjoying themselves, and we love being there with people to soak that in, because again, it helps get through the other stuff that are the challenging side of things. So I would say there's rewards all along the way, just like there's challenges all along the way.
Truly, I think that you've found a wonderful middle ground, because I've been able to see the end result of it and thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a special memory for me, and it's definitely a place I'll be returning with my friends, with my family.
Amazing.
I want to thank you for your time and for your energy, explaining to us the wonderful work that you do as a wine grower, as a strong contributor to the economy of Ontario and of Niagara, a person who is taking the responsibility of, you're creating jobs, and you are also working with Mother Nature, and you are making wonderful vegan wine. So there's a lot of check marks besides the Culinary Estate Winery. It was such a pleasure. Chris, I want to thank you for your time. And do you want to please tell us once again the website?
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Eva. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and as I said to you earlier, it's so nice when people are wanting to hear our story and taking their time to share our story. So thank you very much. Our website is culinarywines.com, COLANERI wines.com.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for your time. Thank you for staying with us for part 2. Until next time, I'm Eva John for Cool Life Podcast. Bye.
And that was our show. Thank you for listening to the very end. Please remember to subscribe through your streaming service to get more access to our guest interviews. Also, please subscribe on YouTube to help support our podcast. Until next time, I'm Eva John for Cool Life Podcast. Thank you for turning me on.